Thank you, everyone. I'm Karl Zingheim. I'm the staff historian here for the USS Midway Museum. And I decided we concluded our last session a year ago that we've got 2023 coming up, and that's another anniversary year after we'd come off the rather heady cake cutting celebration of the Washington Treaty Centennial. So what could we do for 23? And I seized upon a rather peculiar peacetime fiasco for the U.S. Navy, the Point Honda disaster, wherein 7 destroyers, one right after the other practically, piled up within a few yards of each other on the Pinnacle Rocks of Southern California. And so the basis of this presentation is simply an anniversary review. It's not intended in any way to be an academic dissection, but it's 2023. We have a 1923 disaster. I think it is time to devote some attention to what happened and some of the underlying reasons, some of which are a little bit surprising. But best of all, this is yet another chapter in the colorful drama of what has to be probably some of the most remarkable ships in at least the mechanized era of naval history. Some 273 four-stacker flush deck destroyers were produced in the last stages of the First World War, when the United States finally entered the conflict in a rather disjointed way, started to mass produce all manner of things. Unfortunately for the four-stackers, not very many of them were completed in time to see effective action during the First World War, but they sure were plentiful in being the destroyer choice for the U.S. fleet in the interwar period. And so, although we're going to be covering what turns out to be a tragic aspect, what's really nifty, though, is that this is just one small section of that entire panoply of service in World War I, more service in World War II, and as we'll see here, a whole bunch in between. But first, we have to talk about the conditions in which the Honda disaster had actually taken place, and it has a lot to do with the fact that the U.S. Navy, as a large force, was still new to the West Coast. Because of the self-destruction of the Kaiser's Navy in 1919, and the fact that it was beginning to look like there weren't very many excuses for having plans for a naval war against Britain. It was always theoretical, but the opportunities of actually having a conflict with the British after the First World War were starting to diminish. And rather than maintaining a force on the East Coast to be able to fight a potential conflict with our English cousins, another force was arising on the other side in the Pacific. And so the Navy pulled up anchor beginning in 1919 and extending through the early 1920s, and in bits and pieces began to transition to call the West Coast its new home to face their next theoretical opponent, the Japanese Navy. So what happens with Honda has in some small measure to do with the fact that we have this bodily shift of the United States Navy to the Pacific coast. And of course, in the long run, for our own metropolis here in San Diego, enormous implications for the future. So what we're really dealing with is part of the underlying conditions for this extraordinary naval disaster. It's the fact that the Navy is basically having growing pains on an underdeveloped infrastructure, naval infrastructure on the West Coast. Essentially, you have 2 shipyards active at this point, Puget Sound, all the way up in Washington. You've got Mare Island upriver from San Francisco Bay. Not a lot of harbors or other navigable points along the West Coast compared to what you have at the Eastern Seaboard or even the Gulf Coast of America. So for instance, to show you what the growing pains are like, and there's going to be a more specific instance later in this presentation, this is a snapshot of the U.S. fleet, as it was called in those days, essentially battle force in its new home port and Anchorage. So this is San Pedro. Here's several battleships at anchor here, and that's your base. That is the concentrated base for the U.S. battle force. You've got outlying stations in San Diego, for instance, but San Diego is still too shallow to take capital ships at this point, so they wind up getting destroyers, supplementary services like the Naval Hospital, Naval Training Center is about to open about this time, and so on. But the fleet as far as the operational arm is concerned, is all based out of an anchorage. So lots of growing pains in being able to develop and thresh out the rest of the naval infrastructure in California at that time. Another issue, of course, after the war ends in 1918, 1919 timeframe is the fact that this is a time of retrenchment and military spending and extreme parsimony. The fleet that tried to expand in the last stages of World War I is now severely retracted. We're about to enter into international negotiations. The Washington Naval Treaty had been signed just before this disaster. So you have a period of retrenchment and parsimony in operating funds. So here's a picture of incoming Secretary Edwin Denby of the Harding administration and his predecessor, the reformist Josephus Daniels. So we're having a shift in both growing pains and trying to painfully develop an expensive naval infrastructure on the West Coast, almost from scratch, and the fact that the attitudes coming from the national government are on military retrenchment and penny pinching. However, there were still operations allowing the fleet to be able to practice its plans and to train its personnel and to try out new innovations. And so in the summer of 1923, the fleet had just concluded a series of exercises in the Northern Pacific, and in early September, put into San Francisco Bay for Fleet Week. So this would be a time to come in, have ships open for public curiosity, have the crews be able to relax and unwind from grueling operations. And this is a picture of one of the ships that just 1 week later would wind up on the rocks off Point Honda in Southern California. This is the Nicholas coming into the beginning of the Fleet Week celebrations, passing a newly completed New Mexico class battleship. So the fleet's coming in, they're going to Oakland, they're going to San Francisco, and they're enjoying themselves for a week. But after Fleet Week concludes, it's time to get back to business. And so the commander of the destroyer's battle force, Rear Admiral Karl, basically just received a message. The Secretary of the Navy says we have a new budget in, we've got the new fiscal year enacted. You're now permitted to be able to have an extended trial of your cruising turbines, meaning that instead of having a 15-knot restriction on your speed, you could run them out for an extended period, a day, perhaps 20 knots to stretch out and test your cruising turbines on your destroyers. So Admiral Karl passes this on to his two squadron commanders, and the one that we're concerned with in particular is the commander of Destroyer Squadron 11, Captain Edward Watson. And essentially, he basically tells his captains and his division commanders, we're going to enjoy having a 20-knot run, and I intend to use that on our scheduled return back to San Diego. So this is a critical part of the buildup for the fiasco that we had at Honda, is that he was determined to be able to have a high-speed run in accordance with this directive, but he chose to go inside the Channel Islands on his return. What's more, and what came out with some of the investigations and the inquiries, this wasn't made clear to the personnel, the captains in his own squadron. Now, in point of fact, the real irony is that Captain Tome of the neighboring Desron 12 opted to take advantage of that, but he decided to stay to seaward the entire trip. And so as things developed, he had an uneventful passage to seaward of the Channel Islands, arriving at San Diego none the worse for wear. Yet for some reason, Captain Watson not only wanted to have a steady 20-knot advance right down the wild coast of Central California, he was going to go ahead and make an eastward jog and get inside the busy Santa Barbara Channel at 20 knots at night before radar was invented. So what could possibly go wrong with this recipe? And I haven't even mentioned the weather. So here we have a little bit of overconfidence. So we got a little bit of the human factor entering in the story at this point. So the morning of 8 September 1923, the destroyer set up. Thanks to our wonderful friends, a great bunch of guys at navsource.org. They're not a government organization. They're a bunch of volunteers, much like us, whose mission in life is to digitize and publish every known photograph of every single US ship as far back as they can go. Thanks to their plethora of coverage of all 273 of the completed four stackers, I was able to select from other ships, even in a slightly different time from 1923, a representation of what the squadron was doing before it went into its time of destiny. So 8 September 1923, the four stackers set out from both squadrons right past the Presidio through the Golden Gate, well before the bridge. So very similar to this somewhat later image. They set off to go engage in exercises and then to conduct that fateful 20-knot run. And so it's basically a series once you get out past the Farallones in the typically choppy waters you have over there of division tactics and daytime maneuvering and coming in close and basically working out the kinks and getting everyone's sea legs back together. So far, not much of a problem. Then, towards the conclusion of the exercise part of this deployment, they came in close to be able to engage in close-in gunnery drill. Here's another one of the vessels that was involved, but what's really important here is that right between the aftermost stack and the searchlight platform just happens to be the canvas sighting target that they use for the close range gunnery practice. So they were able to get in a little bit of everything. You got maneuvering going on, you've got all kinds of speed shifts, and you've got a little bit of gunnery practice. So just another day with the destroyer force, the Greyhounds of the Sea doing their thing. And then finally, at 16:27 hours, flagship Delphi with Squadron Commander Watson on board signals form 1-8. That's basically everybody form in line astern behind, with instructions, of course, as to what order the ships would be in. And so that's the conclusion of the exercise portion of the day's work. And so the destroyers then come back into formation and form a column that theoretically, if they were good on station keeping, would be stretched out well over 2 nautical miles. And that was the start of the 20-knot run. And so the destroyer four stackers all line up and begin their fateful trip down south as the fog is starting to roll in. Oh, and by the way, this is a moonless night day. So don't look forward to being able to have any moonlight to help illuminate things. So moonless night, famous California fog, 20 knots right next to the shore. Distance between the ships theoretically, and I really have to emphasize that because pre-radar, it's really tough to be able to judge and use Siemens eye to get it. But theoretically, 250 yards from foremast to foremast. Now, it's been stated that there was a cheat, there was a trick. If you were a clever OOD, officer of the deck, if you viewed the jackstaff on the ship ahead of you, and you took a look at, the jackstaff on your bow and the staff, the flagstaff astern, so long as your jackstaff isn't getting past where the stern light is, you're within that sweet spot. If you're too far, you see water, okay, you're drifting too far apart. If you're coming in it's overlapping the ship ahead of you, you're closing in. That's their rule of thumb. Yes, you could pull out a statometer and try the dial effect, but it's Siemens eye. So the four stackers are setting off on course 150, yet Delphi does not have a functioning gyro compass. So she has to use her magnetic compass. Furthermore, we're talking it's 16:27 hours when they do this. Their last visual fix is at 11:45. Pelican Point, which is north of the cove that Monterey Bay forms. So largely the greater Bay Area, and they're barreling south to head to San Diego at 20 knots, and their last visual fix was just before noon in Northern California. They're veering away as the California coastline drifts off at 150, and the fog is starting to close in. So his planned track, not known to all his captains, as it turns out. This is the entrance to Santa Barbara Channel. Unfortunately, this is covering over the Channel Islands. San Miguel Island is the smallest of them, most to seaward. Here is Point Conception. That's Port Arguello. That was going to be their next fix. There was a major lighthouse equipped not only with the light, but with a large sound device that would be able to project a sound signal that they could hopefully hear in case of foggy weather. That was going to be their next checkpoint, get their next fix, get to the center of Santa Barbara Channel, and then Watson's intention was to come left to 095, still at 20 knots. Now, the trouble with all this is the four-stackers at this stage are really primitive vessels, and we're going to see how this comes into effect with as the disaster unfolds. For instance, so naturally, there's no radar. Well, it turns out they don't have fathometers either. The British are starting to make those standard on their destroyers at this time, but it's too expensive. So the four-stackers don't have a fathometer. In fact, the only way to get an idea of what your depth is, short of running into it, is to slow down and have a man in the chains to take a lead sounding. And you can't do that with a 20-knot run. So they have no clue that maybe, hey, things are shelving underneath us because they don't have a fathometer. No one wants to take a lead sounding. No radar, of course. And all they have then are visual bearings. The last one, of course, is many hours old. Another factor that's going to come into the actual destruction of these ships, there's no backup. When you lose your steam plant, the ship is dead. It's a hulk. No electricity, no lights, forget propulsion. Some ships have a limited battery bank for radio, but it's very weak. The technology is not that great. There are no diesel generators installed in four-stackers this early. So you lose your plant, your ship is dead effectively, and that doomed a lot that night. So getting back to the parsimony and the relatively raw state of the naval infrastructure, there was one newfangled technology that was entering the navigation field that might have at least lent some assistance. And that was the discovery that not only can you put out radio waves, but with a specially constructed loop, you can pretty well figure out where that signal is coming from, what direction the signal is coming from. It's called direction finding. So this was a rather new technology, really developed up during World War I. It's relatively new for the fleet here in the Pacific theater. But what's really critical here about its contributory effects to the disaster is that the U.S. Naval Communication Station chain is very limited. Essentially, in California, you've got a cluster of them in the Bay Area. And of course, we had some in Cholas Heights here in San Diego, and Imperial Beach. That was another one. Los Angeles has one, and you've only got one more in Port Arguello, which is very close to the turn point into the Santa Barbara Channel. Nothing between that rocky central coast between the Bay Area and Arguello. Why is that important? It's great having a bearing. It's even better if you have a cross bearing, because at least you might get an X marks the spot. The trouble is with these destroyers, they can only rely on Point Arguello giving you only one line of bearing as a supplement to the dead reckoning navigation they are now forced to. They can't see the stars. There's no moon. The fog is starting to become really thick off on their port hand. And as it turns out in practice, radio direction finding is an art, because you're literally turning the loop to get perpendicular to the incoming radio signal. But was he weak over here? Or is he stronger over here? It is an art form. It takes talent to be able to get a spot on, accurate, true bearing on where the signal comes from. Worse, you can't tell if the signal is coming from this way or if it's coming from there. So you have to send out, if they request, a reciprocal alternative, because the signal is just as good as far as DF is concerned from this direction or 180 out. So lots of bugs to iron out. Not all the navigators really trust it. In fact, the lead navigator, the captain of the Delphi, the flag captain, recently concluded a tour teaching navigation at the Naval Academy and had a reputation for being a bold and daring and skilled navigator in all kinds of visibility, including anchoring the Idaho to a successful anchorage in pea soup Alaskan weather. So a supremely confident man, but he really doesn't trust this newfangled technology. So even though they do request bearings, there's another problem with the radio traffic load. Only the flagship could request a bearing specifically to Port Arguello, because They have to receive the message from any ship, including commercial vessels, and do their DFing and be able to calculate where they think the bearing is and send it back to the requester. So having several ships sending in DF requests would obviously overload the circuit, causing all kinds of delays. So only the flagship was allowed to make the requests. Furthermore, all the other destroyers only have two channels to guard. One is the destroyer channel, the other one's the battle force channel. They can't guard any conversations going on between the flagship and Point Arguello, except several did. We basically had to make the call in the Radio Shack. Do we drop one of the channels we're supposed to be guarding so we could at least listen in on the navigational requests? Furthermore, all kinds of ships at this very dark and foggy night were tying up the resources of the guys working the Arguello station, including the destroyer force flagship Melville with Admiral Cattell, who's sailing independently ahead of his ships. And so the first inkling that all might not be well weather-wise in the area where the turn is going to occur, or the frequent requests from Melville for one fix after the other as she's entering this area first. So that should have been a warning sign, but there's supreme confidence. So they're chopping along, they think, at 20 knots. Another problem with the equipment on these early four-stackers, they don't have pit swords or a pedometer at this time. How do you measure a ship's speed? Well, you have a table that says, if we're going so many turns, we therefore should have a certain speed over ground. Well, that could vary a lot. There are a lot of external factors, fouling, or maybe you're not producing a consistent number of turns. And another thing that applies to what happened on this night, there was a lot of pitching. And so quite often the propellers would partially come out of the water as they pitch. That changes your rev count. So as it turns out, all of the deduced reckoning, which is nothing more than a geometric measurement of how far you should go because you have your theoretical speed and you're staying on your theoretical vector, you should be this distance and therefore this type of location in your navigation. But you need to have external fixes to confirm where you are because your ship is still subject to set and drift. The wind and the current, as well as sea state, will affect the progress. The problem with that is, unless you have an external fix, you really don't know what the seas are doing to you course-wise. So this starts to accumulate over the evening. And so what happens as they reconstructed it was that they thought they were right on track, pounding down 2 miles worth of ships, and they'll get to the turn point at 2100 to 095. It turns out when the turn point was actually made, they had been set back and in several miles. And in fact, if you had just kept extending the line, the pileup would not have occurred at Honda. It would have been at the foot of the Point Arguello lighthouse. So the reconstruction was they're pounding at supposedly 20 knots, heading straight for Point Arguello instead of being out here. But they don't have a clue. They're getting all kinds of fixes that they're arguing with Point Arguello. In fact, at one point, the captain of the Delphi, who's the navigation expert, says, give us the reciprocal, because this is not making any sense at all. They give the reciprocal, which would have put them somewhere around here. That sort of fits the paradigm that they're in. So they think, okay, yeah, we're pretty much over here, but they've got us a little more inside, but we're fine. We're largely on track. So we wind up then having these destroyers playing follow the leader, heading straight for land, and they still have to make the turn. So at 2100, Commodore Watson gives the order for the fateful turn. Left standard rudder, let's steady on course 095 to enter the center of Santa Barbara Channel. He doesn't tell anybody else, except instead of a radio signal, and of course the flag signal won't work, or even flashing light, the only signal that's put out alerting any ships that they're about to change course is 2 blasts of the whistle saying, my rudder is to port. An audio signal from, that's it. Bomb, bomb, oh, they're making a left turn. In the inquiry, all the following ships basically expressed surprise that we're suddenly having a course change. So apparently that wasn't even in his night instructions. So he's just piloting this whole thing on the fly. So 2100, Delphi goes ahead and makes her turn for the Commodore's order at 095 with only a whistle signal that can be heard by only a couple of ships following behind. So everybody's having to pay attention to the fact that, and this is at night, by the way, the lights are starting to show a turn. We could barely see the knuckle of water. That's our point where we decide to make our turn. Worse, within a few seconds, she disappears into a solid fog bank. So she makes her turn that takes everyone else by surprise, and then she becomes the invisible destroyer. So what they're actually turning into is not the center of Santa Barbara Channel, but the mainland of the California headlands. And so here is a modern series of a couple of pictures of Point Honda, the Devil's Jaws. Basically, what you have here is it's a sharp cove with the cliffs coming right out. We have a very narrow shelf on the Pacific coast. And here's a head-on shot looking inland of where it's a bit different now because of a century's worth of erosion, but the disaster will largely unfold right here. Yes, you've got the steep cliffs, you've got visible rocks. Even worse, it's a porcupine's nest right under the water, extending right out of igneous rock pinnacles that stick right out, hard as steel on their own. Thin-skinned destroyers at theoretically 20 knots. You do the math, that's a lot of force. So what you're about to see on this crude reenactment, ship by ship, and we're going to go in the order of formation, although it wasn't order of disaster. You have to see it to believe it, and then I've got the pictures to prove that I'm not making this stuff up. So first ship to hit, Delphi. So this is inland, this is north, so she's going 095, total soup, can't see anything. They think they're in the channel. They're scooting along 19, 20 knots, and all of a sudden they feel scraping as though they've run over gravel. What's this? Second and a half later, thump, they just run right over a pinnacle. A couple of seconds later, imagine going to a complete stop in darkness and you're not expecting a sudden stop. Wham, she hits right into the headlands, right here. So, by the way, the seas aren't calm. The seas are swirling around in eddies and currents and drifts. So what we then have is 4 short whistle blasts and the siren sounded, and I thought, my God, we hit San Miguel Island after all. And so while they still have power, because the mains have not flooded yet, they send the signal turn 9 to the rest of the squadron, meaning make a simultaneous left turn, and that'll take you into the deep water of the Santa Barbara Channel. No, it'll just take you into the northern part of the headlands in California. So it was a worthless warning, but it didn't matter because the power finally died off. And then the seas took over as Delphi is losing all her electrical power, her steam power. She can't back off. Her bow is accordionized back to the capstan, and the seas bodily shove her right up against what became known as Bridge Rock, because there's like a little ledge right here that connects like a polyp to California. So right up against it, she's pinched. She can't move, and she's a dead hulk. So that's the first ship to come in. The next ship is the SP Lee. Now, as it turns out, there was a little bit of imprecision in her steering. So when the helmsman finally puts the helm motor to follow in the knuckle that the Delphi made, she lost an additional 200 yards. That gave her 13 more seconds to react. And another thing to keep in mind with the rest of these charts, the visibility is barely a ship length. So you'd say, my God, can't they see what's going on? No, they can't. It's darkness, one after the other. So here comes SP Lee. SP Lee comes in, suddenly sees the Delphi's fading lights, hears the signals. They go crash, emergency back, trying to back out and go hard over on the port helm. She winds up barely missing Delphi, but winds up at about 8 knots. Thump, the thump, the thump. She's right up against the headland. These are sheer cliffs in California right there, and you could reach right out and probably touch the rocks. She's on the pinnacles and rapidly loses power as they punch through. She loses she can't back off, and the plant dies. Ship number 2 stuck right up on the rocks, a stone throw from the flagship. The Young, commanded by Commander William Calhoun, who 20 years later would, of course, rise to 4-star rank as the commander of the Pacific Fleet Service Force, the logistics navy that kept everything going. He's just a new commander in command of the destroyer Young. Young, as it turns out, was the first ship, although she's third in line, she was the first ship to come into Extremis. She's moving along. All right, it's our turn now. Hits the rocks underneath and is sliced as she rolled right over one of those pinnacles, sliced her right open, and she starts to take on water rapidly. Obviously, she loses her plant, and in 90 seconds, she rolls onto her beam ends. So basically, she's a drifting, listing hulk, and by the time she settles on her beam ends, she winds up sitting on a rock ledge. So she's not completely submerged. The crew most of the crew have enough time to be able to scramble and walk the hull as she's starting to roll over onto her starboard side. Chief Peterson, thinking quickly, goes below on the now perpendicular ship, swims around, finds a fire axe, pops back up to the surface and starts pounding out the portholes to give the crew handholds, because this is now a completely beam end ship in a sea. So what keeps the Young stationary here is that she's fully flooded out and sitting on a rocky ledge. Next comes the Woodbury. Woodbury's pounding along, and she had just completed the turn when she's starting to discern, hey, there's something going on. Ships are going off like this. Another ship is starting to turn. I think we've got a problem up ahead. And so they decide to order right rudder to try to avoid the chaos. And so while they have to stop the engines to back because they're seeing that they're getting too close, they lose all way, the sea takes over, and boom, pushes right up. She's got rocks here and a big fat one right off the port bridge wing. She's in a vice. She's not going anywhere. Next in line, Nicholas. So Nicholas comes in, they start to see we've got trouble ahead. They start feeling the thumping. They've hit the spires themselves. So she winds up drifting over here, gets her forefoot caught on the rocks. That's when her power dies and the seas take her and bodily pivot her because she's held fast on the forefoot. And then it relinquishes and she's starting to drift dead. And this crew on the lee is wondering how much longer it's going to take before she backs right into us. And eventually she floods and settles and is pinioned right there on the rocks parallel. The captain decides, all right, I don't have a power plant anymore. We're a dead ship. All hands topside. We're going to ride this out the rest of the night. So the entire crew comes up from below and they all start to take shelter in the limited superstructure of the Nicholas. Not done. Here comes the Farragut, next ship coming up, and say, oh, this is kind of peculiar. What's going on here? And they at least have enough time to stop her. She's a division flagship, and her division commander is none other than Commander William Pye, who goes on to a checkered career early in World War II. He's dubious in the entire navigation picture himself the whole time. Now they're starting to see that there's a lot of chaos of some kind going. One of the earlier ships trying to back out has a funnel flare that briefly illuminates, and you get to see a cul-de-sac of your sister ships in various states of distress. So Farragut slows down, and they suddenly see the overturned Young with the crew on there. And so the captain of the Farragut tries to make a boat rescue, and they're trying to back him off because they don't want to be knocked off their ledge. And the seas are swirling all around. So Farragut is just doing her best just to stay in position when who would come up? The Fuller. The Fuller comes up, and by the way, she's already a dead duck because she'd already hit a pinnacle down here. So Farragut is trying to back out, and then Pye says, look out, here comes the Fuller. The dead Fuller, she has no power, drifts right into the backing Farragut and has a side scrape amidships. So Farragut takes some plating damage from being a glancing blow from her dead sister. And as she's further backing out, she also thumps a rock and has a small hole, but she eventually works her way to seaward and gets out of the area. So what about the Fuller? So after bouncing off the Farragut, she's taking on water. The seas now take over and shove her bodily sideways right into the rocks, literally a couple of steps abaft the Woodbury, who's already on the rocks. And then finally, Chauncey is now aware that there is something going on. There's a real problem here. So the Chauncey's captain decides, okay, I think we can effect a rescue. So he's trying to come in to get men off the young. But the trouble is, and you'll see with the photos, it is this tight. That's asking too much under the circumstances. This is not a tugboat or anything. So he tries to come in. The crew of the young is trying to get him to back off because they don't want him bouncing her off the ledge, and then he would sink into the depths. So what happens is Chauncey kind of comes in, and then she tries to back out. According to the reports, maybe it was a rock, but the reports say she actually ran over the upturned port prop of the young and split her hull from hitting that hard bronze prop. So she's trying to get out, splits herself, and of course, loses power. And the seas take over and carry her bodily and deposit her rather gently, considering, right up against the other side of Bridge Rock. So this is what happens the next morning when the fog clears away. And I'm skipping a lot about the rescue drama and all that, but I'm not making this up. Look how close these ships are. So here's the shot. That's Fuller, that's Woodbury, that's the overturned young. There's Chauncey, and that's Nicholas. The SP Lee's here. Delphi's already snapped in half from the wave action. And it doesn't take long for these ships, even the most mighty ships. I've seen pictures of ocean liners that have been decommissioned, run up on rocks. The sea snaps them in half eventually. The ships are basically piled one atop the other. Look how close they are. Look at the features of the rocks where you have to try and get aboard. And remember, this is at 9 o'clock, so most of the crew is below in some kind of bedding, sleep clothing. They're not prepared to step out on a wet, stormy night onto pinnacles. So it's a very desperate situation. But the point of it is, here's the young. There's Chauncey right up against the rocks. That's Woodbury and Fuller back there. More views. I can't think of a more stunning sight to step up, other than maybe the day after Pearl Harbor with Battleship Row, one ship after the other. 7 destroyers, all within a single panoramic view, thrust up against the rocks. And so eventually, the sea claims its own. By the way, the casualties are surprisingly light, considering the extent of this disaster. Young loses eventually 20 men with her rollover. 3 from the Delphi also succumb to injuries on their dramatic attempt to get onto Bridge Rock. So 23 out of potential 800 men actually lose their lives in this. That's remarkable. So eventually they figure out there is life on the Nicholas after they all came up topside, so they had to come up with a way to get them off. But after the crew is taken care of, the crews are taken care of, the sea starts to work because these ships are clearly beyond economical salvage. And in a very short time, they start to break up. Now, there were instances where, in relative rare times when the sea was somewhat calm, where attempts were made to at least extract useful material. It turns out the best they could do, they did get the torpedoes removed. So all the Mark 14s were preserved. They brought in additional compressed air, got the torpedoes out, and then fished them out of the water. So that was fine, but everything else, $13 million worth of material in 1923 figures, completely up for scrap. And then they had a guard detail there to make sure there wasn't any kind of looting, as if anybody wanted to go out there. So in memoriam then, we do have outside Lompoc, the nearest city to this area, is a very nice plaque listing the names of those who did not come back from this catastrophe. And this is the recovered prop from the Delphi, the flagship that first come in. Rather the worse for wear. Obviously, there was a court of inquiry and there were court-martial proceedings put forth. One remarkable aspect about it is that Captain Watson, the squadron commander in charge of all this, wanted to take all the blame and to shield all his junior officers and his junior captains, and took full responsibility, no alibis, no excuse making at all. In fact, a lot of newspapers at the time commended him for having that kind of moral integrity on display under such extreme circumstances. The remarkable outfall from this, especially when you consider some aspects of modern naval culture, is that the punishments that were meted out were actually quite light. So Yeah, the Commodore Watson eventually was lost 150 lineal numbers. So it basically put him at the bottom of the promotion list for captains, meaning his career was effectively over. So they posted him to be assistant to the commandant of the newly established 14th Naval District in Hawaii, and he retired at the end of the 20s, as did the captain of the Delphi, that overconfident navigator. And many other officers went on to have fruitful careers, such as Admiral Calhoun of World War II. A couple of the captains eventually commanded the battleship Maryland at different times in her pre-war career. So, to tell you the truth, it was a rather light wrapping of the knuckles for a real embarrassing disaster. But it basically comes down to overconfidence in your training and in your own experience, and the fact that we were still really talking about a very primitive way of seafaring in California. So that's the story in brief of the disaster at Honda. So observations.
Did the currents or sea state generated by the Great Kanto earthquake several days prior?
Yeah, there's lots of talk. Yeah, lots of talk about oceanographers. Did the Kanto earthquake a week before kind of put a whammy on the currents? The thing is, if you really get into the oceanography there, it's called the Cape Hatteras of the West Coast for a reason. Conflicted, all changing currents and shifts all around that Point Conception in Arguello area. It changes all the time. So maybe you got an oomph from the Kanto earthquake, but I suspect probably not. The seas are that contradictory and confusing as it is. Yes.
I'm curious just from our own perspective, because it seems so extreme, the actual thinking, but the actual navigation and choosing that course at the time, how unusual was that at standard sort of operating procedures for a 1920s destroyer squadron off the West Coast?
Much ink has been spilled about, yeah.
How unusual was the actual decision-making process?
A lot of it goes back to the supposed character of the dash, of the cavalry of the sea, and the destroyerman mythos. I think what it really turned out to be was a case of overconfidence and probably a little bit of get-home-itis that's playing more than a few private pilots, because they wanted to get back to San Diego at daybreak so they could get the rest of the weekend. This was on a Saturday. So, because take into effect, what did Captain Toom do with his squadron? He stayed out to sea. He didn't want to jog inside. And I have to ask, why is it when the fog is obviously closing in, you haven't had a fix in 8 hours, you're going to deliberately opt to enter busy Los Angeles traffic in the Channel Islands area at 20 knots? That really is hanging it out there. So I think this went beyond the norm.
Well, this is fantastic. When I went through Prospective Commanding Officers course in 1982, we spent at least half the day in Newport looking at accidents like this and shaking our heads in wonder at some of the really stupid decisions commanders sometimes made, even, as I said, relatively recent.
Yes, and when you consider how primitive the navigation was to be able to just really be bold, and I mean, the fog's closing in. Maybe I shouldn't turn into Santa Barbara Channel where I can't see very much ahead of my ship. Just stay to seaward. That would have been prudent.
Documentary has been made. I remember the guy's number.
Oh, certainly.
Santa Barbara on the Memorial Day.
On Memorial Day. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that update. Yes, sir.
Did each ship keeping its own block?
The ships were there. That's one of the other myths that come out, that okay, it's just follow the leader. And in those days, the Navy permitted the lead ship. No, they were maintaining their own navigation, and there were debates, because not all the ships in the squadron got piled up. There were many ships here. The issue was you only have one fix, so your dead reckoning is all you've got, and you're getting into almost a half day without having an external fix. That's frightening. And it caused more than a little heartburn with other ships that did survive.
What weather reports did they have?
Weather reports probably would have been rather accurate, but the trouble is, how do you say the density of the fog ahead of time? How bad's the fog going to be? Especially if you don't have satellite views or anything like that. You just have to go on the lore of what the fog is like at that point. In fact, point of fact, one of the greatest naval disasters in our San Diego region was the collision of two submarines and the F1 foundering right off La Jolla in 1917 because of fog. Her sister didn't like how dense the San Diego fog was on this night transit, so she decided to go seaward, and she ran smack into her sister, the F1, and pierced her, and there's no reserve buoyancy really when you open the ship to the sea. So F1 went down like a stone. Only the conning tower watch survived, including one Alfred Montgomery in command, who later becomes a noted carrier commander in World War II.
Carl, that was
Okay, all done?
one more question.
Yes, sir.
Nothing happened in the Navy without new procedures, new documentation, more heartache. What fallout came from Port Hunter? Like after this, like no longer can you do this, can you do a position fix everything? Were there any
So far as I can
procedural changes?
So far as I can tell, the Navy just sort of shrugged this one off. It's really remarkable how mild the reaction was. And of course, it's not a material setback for the Navy because they've got dozens and dozens in reserve. So they were able to make good the numbers. Thankfully, the loss of life, considering the magnitude of the disaster, was relatively small. So it's really surprising how muted the Navy's response was to this embarrassment. But it did receive there were a lot of condolences sent by professionals in other navies during the court martial, including Admiral Bailey, who ran the destroyer patrols with the British and the Americans out of Ireland, and the Japanese sent some condolences as well. So there was a lot of professional mariner camaraderie being meted out for Captain Watson and his plight. Okay.